Good evening, everyone. So, yeah, it's just a bit of an introduction, really. Won't be able to cover everything, but I'm going to talk about stuff that I think will be more appropriate to you and mention some of the things that landowners can do to help benefit amphibians and reptiles, even if it's just in a garden situation. So let's have a look. So my name's Pete Hill. My father was a Welshman. But he was stationed in the army down south. So I was born down south where there's lots of sandy heathlands. And I grew up really interested in amphibians and reptiles. Dug my first pond when I was 8. I found my first sand lizard when I was 9, and not a lot has really stopped, really. They all thought I'd grow out of it. Thought it was just a childhood thing, but I'm 55 now, so I don't think I'm going to grow out of it, to be honest. So that's a sand lizard on my hand. That's a northern dune race sand lizard. That's the type of animal we have living on certain sand dune systems in Wales. Very rare, very beautiful. But I grew up with them in the southern heaths. That's where I learned about them to start off with. When I came back to Wales, land of my father, we set up an amphibian and reptile group, a bunch of eager people there. And then after that, I started working with ARC. This is where I grew up when I was a kid. This is the rolling sandy heathlands that I grew up on. All native species of reptiles there, including smooth snake and sand lizard. So I spent a lot of time wandering around on that habitat, possibly when I maybe should have been at school. Anyway, that's a book that I used to carry with me. It's a little gem. It's from the 50s when it was written, but the guy, there's a lot of it, a lot of bits of it are outdated. But as for actual observations of the behavior of the animals, it is unsurpassed. It really still is. It's obviously somebody who spent a great deal of time in the field, sitting still and observing them, which is what I spend a lot of time doing too. So yeah, if you can pick that up on Amazon if you're interested, it's a fascinating read. So reptiles and amphibians, if it's one of our commonest reptiles, the slow worm, Anguis fragilis, or one of our rarest amphibians, the natterjack. That's a female full of spawn. She looks pretty round, doesn't she? Epidalia calamita. They're pivotal components in the ecosystem, forming both predator and prey roles. They're great for introducing kids into nature. They're diurnal, most of them. You can see them in the daytime, and you can see the kids' faces there looking at some slow worms. It's a really good introduction to nature for young people. And then, of course, the great crested newt, Triturus cristatus, always in the news. The bane of the life of developers. Lots of issues there. Talking of development, that's one of the many threats to amphibians and reptiles. So historically, development and change of land use has been pretty devastating for reptiles in particular, removing vast amounts of habitat and fragmenting it also. So there's lots of issues for amphibians and reptiles. This is just one aspect. For amphibians, the trouble starts before they even get out of hibernation. So you can see spreading grit there because of icy roads. So when the amphibians emerge from hibernation and travel across the roads to breed, they're still everywhere. Newts just dehydrate and don't even get as far as the pond. And frogs that can hop and kind of probably, ooh, ow, as they get across it. There's some really unusual stuff happens. You get gender imbalances. So it's actually reducing the amount of female frogs that contact with this, which isn't great either. When they do finally get to the pond, like this toad, on the way to the pond, sorry, like this toad, there's all kinds of issues of being run over. So can you see the male toad there? He's sitting bolt upright. That's because he's come across this flat area of land, which to him is a good vantage point to seek out big females on the way to the pond, because if he sees a female on the way to the pond, he can jump on top and have a free lift to the pond and secure a female before any other males do. So he's not even trying to cross the road. He's hanging around in the road because to him, it's a vantage point. So you can see what a disaster that is. He's not aware of cars. So instead of just crossing the road quickly, he's deliberately loitering there, scanning for females. You can see that pose he's in. And the top right there, we've got industrial use of fertilizers, fungicides, herbicides. Amphibians have got porous skins. It's absolute nail in the coffin for them. Yet another one. Lots of imported diseases, chytridiomycosis, red leg. There's a whole list of them, generally because of introduced species, alien species bringing fungal pathogens, etc. with them. That's another nail in the coffin. Rats, introduced predator. Rats are pretty much everywhere that people have been, followed us all around the world. Rats can be a nuisance for hibernating reptiles, getting in there when they're hibernating and chewing them up. But particularly for amphibians in the breeding season, they can really cause big die-offs. They're not the greatest of, they don't know what to do with the toad properly, for example. Some of them learn how to strip the poison glands, but seeing as rats only live 2 years tops, then the most times they're going to encounter breeding amphibians is twice, so they really don't get a chance to learn properly. So you get big heaps of dead and dying frogs and toads every year at ponds at which there's plenty of rats. I've got loads of gory pictures of it. I'm going to spare you of that. I've got equally gory pictures of grass snakes run over on the road. It's endless, but I'm not going to show you these gory pictures tonight. You just take my word for it. Cats, that's a cat with an adder. Some cats are better at it than others, but single animals can be particularly efficient. Yeah, that's an adder. So the adder may be venomous, but it is far from invincible. A hedgehog can kill an adder. Shrews kill young adders. There's a pheasant, another introduced species, quaffing down a grass snake. Absolute nightmare for biodiversity of all kinds. Pheasants, I won't bang on about it. It's all anthropogenic, all these issues. And speaking of people themselves, adder vigilantes. There's some. That's the goriest picture I'll show you tonight. Some adders that have been killed by adder vigilantes and draped across the sign at the nature reserve. So you can see, it's, what did they say? What was the song Kermit the Frog sang? It's not easy being green, right? It's not easy being an amphibian and reptile in the UK. So looking at amphibians first, what makes them tick? They function according to the temperature, okay, the environment, and they become dormant during extremely cold conditions. They have permeable skins, which allows them to diffuse gases and liquids through their skins, so frogs can hibernate beneath the water and stay submerged. They slow their metabolism down so much they can absolutely hibernate beneath the water for months at a time and just diffuse sufficient oxygen through their skin. So that's fantastic, but it's not great when you've got lots of fungicides, herbicides, fertilizers spread about the place if you've got absorbent permeable skins. They need suitable water bodies to breathe within, and they mostly feed on invertebrates. Okay, it's got to move for a frog or a toad to recognize it as food. The movement is what stimulates them to feed. Contrary to popular belief, because it's easier to find amphibians when they're in the water, generally, they spend the vast majority of their lives on land. Okay, and that's important to know. And it's encouraging if you want to do stuff for them in your garden and bit of land you've got and you can't dig ponds. There's plenty you can do for them without ponds. Newts, that's a great crested newt, female. Little tip to tell them from other newts: don't worry too much about, has it got web feet, has it got a crest, blah 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 blah. Look at its skin. You can tell within a split second, is that skin smooth or is it granular? It's granular. It can only be one thing: a great crested or warty newt. Clues in its other name, warty. That skin is unmistakably warty and granular, isn't it? Can't be anything else. They like weedy pools to breed in, different to the frogs. Toads, bufo, very different. Again, they like to breed in big, large, permanent water bodies, often with fish present, which is unusual for amphibians. More about that soon. So what makes good amphibian habitat? As you know, they all are totally dependent on water in which to breed. They're tied to water for breeding. Okay, so ponds, scrapes, ditches, vital habitat. But different amphibian species, because they have different ecologies, they need different types of water body types. Sometimes you find amphibians breeding together in ponds that are not particularly suitable, particularly for any of them, but it's the only choice they have, so they're forced to breed together. In actual fact, they have very different requirements. Like I said, toads often use large permanent water bodies, totally different to frogs. Remember, amphibians spend a lot of time on land. There's some great crested newts I found within a dry stone wall in Brecon. So wood leaf litter, hedgerows, dry stone walls inside them, anywhere that they can get inside where it's humid, and also to get away from the frost during the winter. Habitat requirements: when on land, it's really simple. Suitable vegetated cover, everything they need, humid resting places, invertebrate food everywhere, safe place to hibernate. Connectivity, that's really important. It allows natural recolonization of areas if species become extinct locally, which does happen, like if there was a poisoning or a fire or something like that. If there's connectivity, then they can recolonize. So garden ponds, what you can do in your garden for amphibians and reptiles. I'm not going to bang on about too much detail about creating ponds. There's loads of information out there. I'm just going to touch on it. So this is a garden pond. This is my garden pond a month after I created it, and I used bentonite to line it, which is why you can't see any liner. It's cloudy because it's got a layer of substrate on top of the liner. Okay, a month old. There it is a year later. It's got water like vodka, crystal clear, lots of vegetation growth. You can't see the liner, vegetation right up to the edge, ideal for wildlife. And here it is another year on. Okay, so a lot of vegetation. You can just see those reeds starting to encroach into the pond. So the year after, I'd get in there in the winter and I'd pull about a third of it out. And that's what you have to do to manage ponds. If you don't manage them, i.e. we haven't got beavers chopping down willows that encroach, we haven't got deer wading in there grazing in the summer, it will just become a vegetated, marshy area, and then eventually a willow copse. What I'll briefly touch on with pond creation without going about it in too much detail is the important aspects of depths. So look at the shallows there, extensive shallows, 0 to 10 centimeters. So where water's less than 10 centimeters deep, that is the most biodiverse part of the pond. So the more shallows you can have, it's good for health and safety as well. The more shallows you can have all the way around the edge, the better. And then it speaks for itself there. You can see where other plants prosper, and there's very few by comparison in the deeper water. Okay, it all happens in the shallows. If you see that raised bar at the bottom of the pond, that's to enable plants such as liverworts to grow in it. They like low nutrients, so nutrients tend to gather at the bottom of the pond. So these raised bars enable different plant species to colonize as well. That's getting into real detail. Narrow drawdown zones. So we don't really want the garden centre inspired pond with the shelving. Shelving doesn't work. You get high and low seasonal water levels. So you can see in those diagrams, we've got a line showing the high water level and lower levels, you see, and you can see how it changes. So at the bottom, you've got a nice wide drawdown zone. Okay, compared to the narrow one above, it's got far more opportunities for biodiversity. And you can see the way that pond's being created, the shallows. Once we reach the shallows, then we go up and down again, leaving lots of scope to have little puddles form when it's got a low water level. And those little puddles that remain are absolutely vital for all kinds of invertebrates. Fish and compatibility. This is particularly relevant for garden ponds. So toads, top of the list, they positively benefit from living with fish. That's unique amongst UK amphibians. Okay, common frog, smooth newt, palmate newt, they can just about cope, and some will survive because the way that their larvae, tadpoles, behave, they tucked away, hidden all the time. So some will survive, but they're all on the menu for fish. Right at the bottom, the great crested newt just can't hack it, cannot breed where there's fish present. I don't know why it's taken a while to load up. Here it comes. So yeah, frogs prefer shallow temporary water bodies that are free of fish to breed. So Rana temperaria, the temporary frog, literally. Okay, that's its name. So the temporary frog, because it just appears for 3 or 4 days, hundreds of them breed and then vanish, and you don't see them again because they're mostly terrestrial. Not only is their behavior perceived as temporary, but they much prefer to breed in temporary water bodies because there's no dragonfly larvae, very few predators in there. So a shallow puddle, and they gamble the fact that it might dry out too quickly against the fact that there's no predators. Okay, smooth newts can sometimes survive where there's fish. because of the way they behave. The larvae, they're tucked away in the mud and in the vegetation, but they do a lot better where there aren't fish. So if it's a garden pond you're thinking of, big fish in a little pond really works in that scenario. Try not to have fish. The great crested newt just cannot deal with fish, and this is why. There's a great crested newt larvae. It has a very different feeding strategy to the others. You can see it's literally floating high in the water column. That's termed as pelagic. It feeds on plankton and it floats suspended high in the water column, right out in the open, literally grabbing plankton as it floats by. And that's great if there's no fish about, but if you're a soft-bodied amphibian floating around like that, you're just going to get gobbled up. So they just cannot cope with fish, not for breeding anyway. There's another look, and while we got this opportunity, what's different about a great crested newt larvae to the other newts? Can you see its gills are very concave in that shape? Yeah, curled round, concave. The other species don't have that concave effect. Also, it's got that humpbacked look of its, the finnage of its tail. The other species don't have that either. It's what keeps it suspended, floating in the water like that. And if you can just about make out its toes, it's got really long toes. That's very indicative of it being a great crested newt larvae. It's about mid-term, half developed, and those black speckles on the tail finnage, they're characteristic of great crested newt larvae too. So breeding for frogs and toads, we term it explosive because literally every animal in the colony is there, crash bang all at once, all over in a couple of days. The idea is to inundate predators with sheer numbers. So you've got frogs on the left there, toads on the right. That embrace is termed amplexus, the piggyback embrace. It's not copulation. They don't have penises. It's the male is just literally taking a ride on the female's back and waiting to be in the right position for external fertilization, much like fish in the water. So in the case of toads, he positions his toes, the male positions his toes so he can feel the spawn when it passes over his toes, and he knows that's when to release the sperm. Frogs on the left there. Good way to tell males and females. People struggle telling male and female frogs apart. Here's a little clue. Look at the throats. Look at this lot then. These are all frogs and amplexus. Look at the throats. The males have all got pale white throats. The female frogs are much more beautiful, a bit like humans, much more beautiful than the male frogs. Far more variety of colours. And look at the throats on the females. All different combinations. There's chocolate and yellow on the far left, lots of reddish tinge. Very different to the males. There are other ways to tell them apart, but that one, you can't fail, can you? It's so simple. It's not in any of the textbooks. I don't know why. Here's an example of an extremely colourful female frog. Look at her throat, and there's a male. Look at his throat. Okay, you get the picture. Frog spawn, I don't really have to describe what frog spawn's like. Everyone's seen frog spawn before. Temporary water bodies, shallow water. They need it to be in shallow water so that it will heat up quick, algae will grow quick, and the tadpoles will grow quick. The tadpoles want to be out of the pond as soon as possible. They don't want to spend a second longer in the dangerous environment of a pond than they have to, which is why they choose these shallow puddles with no predators. So a clump of spawn, when you get a load of clumps, is referred to as a mat. There's a couple of albino clumps in that mat on the bottom right, and on the bottom left you can see a spore mat in production, and again you can see how the white throats of the males really stand out, don't they? Toad spawn, different story. Strings, and the females like to wind the egg strings around vertical plant stems. It keeps them from sinking to the bottom where the water's too cold and where there's lots of predators. And that picture on the far right, you can see the far right reeds, two far right reeds. In between the two sets of reeds, look down, you'll see a pair of toads facing to the left. You can see how much bigger the female is and the male on top. So she's just been going backwards and forwards, winding those egg strings around those reeds, and you can see. Frog tadpoles, when they hatch out, they've got these external gills. You can see in the bottom left there, the external gills. People think they're black. Look at the color variation close up in those tadpoles. They're all different colors, just like the adult frogs themselves. Top right, you can see recently hatched tadpoles right in the egg mass. Remember, it's in shallow water. It looks very green, doesn't it? And that's because algae is already grown on the gelatinous egg mass. The tadpoles will hatch out, and you can see like a big mass of the tadpoles in the center there. They'll just eat the algae and the egg mass. By the time they've finished eating that, they're free swimming. Okay, when they're free swimming, they behave differently. Everything wants to eat them, so they get the hell out of there, and they're generally down the bottom in the mud hiding. You can see a well-developed frog tadpole on the bottom right compared to a toad tadpole. Frog on the left, toad on the right. Now, the frog tadpole is slightly bigger. That's because they've spawned slightly earlier than the toad, and you can see he's got back legs developing, but they're very, very different. You really can't, by any stretch of imagination, describe the frog tadpole as black, can you? That one's olivey green with pinkish speckles. It's definitely not black. The toad tadpole, much more kind of velvety Bourneville chocolate black brown. There's your toad tadpoles again. So this is where I'm going to tell you about the fish thing with toads. They're so different to frog tadpoles. So can you see them? They're forming mass shoals there. They're grouping together. They're grazing in the shallows on algae, but they swim around without a care in the world. If you were looking into a pond and you looked into the pond and you saw some tadpoles shoot away straight away and hide down in the mud, they're frogs. If you see them swimming around together without a care in the world, it's toad tadpoles. And that's because they've got toxic skin. Frog tadpoles have got no protection at all, other than just to get the hell out of there. Toad tadpoles, they have toxic skin, so they can swim around in a big shoal. Fish don't find them very tasty, so fish will take in a mouthful of toad tadpoles for the first time, spit them out again, won't touch them ever again. But if you think about it, things such as dragonfly larvae, beetle larvae, water scorpions, there's a whole host of predatory invertebrates that live in ponds and lakes. They bypass the toxic skin of a tadpole by grabbing the tadpole and piercing its toxic skin and draining the contents. So they bypass that. So fish predate these invertebrates that are predating the tadpole. So fish possibly lower the impact on toads. So fish and toads have evolved together. The other amphibians, avoid them. Newts, they breed in a very different way. It's much less explosive. It's much more protracted because they have to lay one egg at a time. They can't just dump the whole lot and get out of there. So this is a great crested newt female. I photographed her at night under torchlight. You can see her front legs out, keeping her floating. Her back legs you can't see because they're busy wrapping, folding a leaf of the plant around her eggs. Okay, that's how you find newt eggs. And there's a difference between great crested newt eggs when they're freshly laid. They're almost white, as opposed to the buff, browny, pinky color of either of the other two species. You couldn't tell whether they were smooth or palmate without taking them to the laboratory. But the great crested newt eggs look very different. More examples of where you find great crested newt eggs, leaves folded over. The bottom left there, you can see that egg. You can see the fold underneath it where somebody's unfolded it, so you can see the egg. Okay. And top right, you can see that bit of reed has been folded over multiple times with several eggs hidden in it. More examples, you get the picture. Okay, so to try and differentiate, focus on newly laid eggs. Once they start to develop, it becomes a lot more difficult. Okay, and that's probably a great crested newt larva you were looking at there in the egg still. Garden ponds versus newts. What am I talking about? So when people make garden ponds for frogs, I regularly get this inquiry all the time. We made our garden pond, we had loads of frogs to start with, and now it's been taken over by newts. So frogs like temporary water bodies. When you make a new pond, it looks like a new temporary water body because it hasn't got predators, hardly any plants, it's a puddle. So frogs converge on it. They're also a lot more mobile. Okay, they're much more mobile than a newt. Newts, whether it's a palmate newt or a smooth newt, there we are, they get there eventually. They've only got little legs, but once they do get there in a small pond, they will eat a lot of the tadpoles, frog tadpoles, and they will also consume some of the spawn by sucking the eggs out of the jelly mass. Okay, so in a small pond, they tend to take over. So do you want a pond or a puddle? Temporary puddles are better for frogs. Permanent ponds are better than newts. Why not have both if you've got room? Just looking once more at that pond diagram I showed you earlier, looking at the shallows, imagine if you created a pond that was no deeper anywhere than 30 centimeters and you had hardly any vegetation in it. Birds would use it as a bird bath when the frogs weren't using it, but you could manage it deliberately for frogs by clearing it out and letting it dry out. Okay, just like the puddles do that they use in the wild, and then filling up naturally with rain. And it's not the end of the world if you use tap water. It really isn't. The problem with tap water is it's got lots of nitrates in it, and if you use it in a pond, you'll end up with duckweed, etc. If you're making a little frog puddle for your frogs, it really is a temporary thing. You could clean it out each year and keep it just for frogs. You can get both species going in your garden quite easily. Succession is when the natural process of vegetation takes over a pond if it's not interrupted. So this is my garden pond again, just to remind you what happens with succession. Okay. And here's a look in the wider countryside of the stuff I get up to. So this is a middle of a field in Monmouthshire, a willow copse. That used to be a pond. If you leave ponds alone, they end up like that. You've got no beavers, nothing doing any management at all. If you leave a pond alone, that's what it looks like after a while. When you get closer, you can see what's left of the pond. So we're often restoring these ponds. So we'll dive in there at a certain time of year, in the winter generally, when there's less impact. We'll cut the willows down. We'll leave really high stumps. We'll chip the willow. We can't do anything else with it because it restores, it regenerates really quickly. Often use chip willow to create egg-laying sites for grass snakes. More about that in a bit. But we leave really high stumps, and that gives leverage for the digger to pull out the roots, and we get rid of the roots. By the time we've done that, you've pretty much got the pond restored. All we need to do then is reprofile the edges. It's bathed in sunlight, walk away. Sunlight plus water equals life, and it explodes. Stuff you can do on the terrestrial side: log piles, lots of structural diversity, loads of places to hide. Rotting timber provides all kinds of invertebrate food for the amphibians that are using it. It wouldn't just be amphibians that use it either. But yeah, log piles are a superb addition. If you can't have a pond, have a log pile. If you can have a pond, have a log pile. Longer grass. Maybe leave your grass grow a bit longer, because as you can see on the right, we've got a mass emergence of toadlets. Remember, toad tadpoles swim around together in shoals. They're much more synchronized than frog tadpoles, which tend to spend time apart in different parts of the pond. So with toads, when they emerge, it really is synchronized and they're everywhere. And there they are. So they need lush vegetation in which they can hide and find food, move about without getting in trouble. You don't want vegetation to shade the pond. You don't want trees blocking the light, making it too cool and dropping leaves in. You really don't want that. Edges and junctions with your grass. If you leave longer grass, and you can create different sward heights, so you've got junctions between short grass and longer grass, you can do that, and that's great for amphibians, and it's awesome for reptiles as well, especially if they're south-facing edges. If you're worried about killing animals, do it in a two-faced cut. We do that at work when we're trying to make things unattractive to amphibians and reptiles when we want to do some work and we want them out of the way. We call it passive displacement. You cut a high cut, about 20 centimeters high, everything gets out of the way. You go back the next day, you cut down to the ground. You can also, in a garden situation, you can choose the right seasonality and weather conditions to employ avoidance measures with the animals as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, it depends what we're talking about. If it's amphibians, you've got a pond in the garden full of tadpoles, and you can see they've all got their back legs, they're going to be emerging soon, then obviously do it before they emerge. You don't want to be doing it when there's hundreds of baby froglets everywhere. If it's reptiles you're doing it for, do the cutting on a baking hot day. Okay. Contrary to popular belief, a really hot day is a hard day to see reptiles. They don't need to be basking on a hot day. It's warm enough. They're hidden out of the way. If it's baking hot, they're tucked down right out of the way, so you can cut grass without any fear of it. If it's cooler and they need to be out to bask to warm up, that's not a good time to do it. Okay. Connectivity, we know about this. It's really important. Okay. So amphibian populations do suffer from local extinction quite regularly. It's a good way to maintain genetic diversity also, but they've got to be able to recolonize. So yeah, Lots of gardens can really help with this. Lots of wildlife friendly gardens and their managers can help with this. So now let's look at reptiles. They're ectothermic, so entirely reliant upon an external heat source, and they become dormant during the winter. They have watertight skins, very different to amphibians. Feed mainly on vertebrates, insects, worms, etc. In the case of lizards and snakes, generally other vertebrates, amphibians, fish, lizards, small mammals, sometimes small birds. So most land-based UK reptile species, I say land-based because we also get turtles in British waters. Most of our UK land-based reptiles are viviparous, that's live-bearing, okay? That's an adaptation to living so far north. It's not a fantastic idea to rely on the Welsh environment to incubate eggs externally. So the common or viviparous lizard, slowworm, adder, and in England, the smooth snake, they're all live-bearing. The other two species that are egg-laying, viviparous, sand lizard. Now, sand lizard is our rarest reptile, and it's confined to areas where there's sand, obviously for thermoregulation. You know how hot sand gets, they can warm up on it, but also for incubating eggs. Grass snake is also egg-laying. What the grass snake does is it uses decomposing organic matter, which produces heat and humidity in which to incubate its eggs. Okay, so natural instances are a lot rarer now. I haven't got time to explain all about that, but they just occur very rarely. They tend to use man-made instances now, such as dung heaps, etc. So ectothermic, that means reliant on an external heat source. So as mammals, we are endotherms. We produce our heat internally because we eat so much. These guys are more the economy model, okay? Cold-blooded, it's not really an accurate term to use because when reptiles are active, they're often warmer than we are, okay? So I can't really say they're cold-blooded in that instance. Ectothermic is a much more accurate way to describe them. You've got some young common viviparous lizards there. One on the far right's already lost the end of his tail, which can regenerate. And you can see lizard droppings. Can you see those little dark droppings with the white cap at the end? That's your classic lizard dropping. So if you go out looking on a day when the sun's not shining and you see those, at least you know you're looking in the right place. So don't produce their own heat internally. They have to use external warmth to raise their body temperatures. So all of the behavior is determined by ectothermy and also thermoregulation. That just is a posh word for meaning they move to and away from heat as they need to. They're regulating their temperature. Okay, they can get too hot as well, you know, so they have to move to somewhere cooler when it's too hot. British reptiles, especially things like adders and common lizards, they're hard as nails. They're really tough. The adder is the only species of snake within the Arctic Circle. It's a tough cookie. Here you've got one basking on emergence, it's a male, and there's snow on the ground right next to it. But its hibernation site has been chosen deliberately for its features for thermal dynamics. So it's probably warm as toast there. This is what reptiles need: warmth, structural complexity. Now, what I mean by that, structural complexity provides lots of opportunities for microclimates, doesn't it? You don't just want flat ground that's exposed. And habitat connectivity, we know all about that. We know why they want that. Some reptile habitats, such as heathland, there's got heathland in Torfaen there, in the valleys of Wales, Torfaen, and also sand dunes. That's the, you know, that's the climax vegetation. You don't get trees there, so it very rarely needs managing. It can manage itself for reptiles. You've got the same thing going there, two very different habitats, but look, undulating terrain in both instances, affecting lots of opportunities for south-facing banks and tucked away from the wind, etc. Vegetation patchy in places with bare patches in between, nothing more than 1 meter in height. The bonus that you've got on the sand dune is that the gaps in between the vegetation are sand, and you know how warm sand gets. Absolute paradise for reptiles. However, most habitats the reptiles occupy, they're destined to revert to the climax vegetation without some kind of interference. So without beavers and the natural system of thing, grazing, etc., going on, like you saw with the ponds, it will all go to woodland. So neither extreme is favourable for reptiles. On the left there's just no opportunities for anything. It's totally exposed. There's no structural diversity. On the right, too shaded for reptiles. So mid-successional stage is best. So the varied topography is talking about that. Again, we're back up in Torvine. Gives you that diverse vegetation structure of different heights, ages, lots of pockets of microhabitat there. It's combined with varied topography, it's absolute paradise for reptiles. So the microhabitats provided by that varied topography and complex vegetation structure, they provide everything they need. A range of basking opportunities. There's a adder on the left. He's raised himself up onto that bank to take advantage of the aspect and the direct hit from the sun. Shelter from predators, shelter from wind, an abundance of prey, opportunities to cool down in humid, deeper vegetation when the weather is hot and dry, like that young slowworm. That's a neonate slowworm, probably just a few weeks old there at the bottom. Tussocky Molinia grass is a great habitat for reptiles. Look, imagine you're a lizard. You're not 6 foot tall. You're a lizard, lizard height. Look at all those opportunities for protection from the wind and basking, all those microclimate opportunities there. They're everywhere, aren't they? And they can also, small things like lizards and slowworms can actually hibernate within those tussocks. Here's an adder in a Molinia tussock. Hard to spot. You can see it's got a milky eye. Can you just spot its eye is a bit milky blue there? That's because it's about to slough, shed its skin. So when they're going to slough, they secrete this fluid to help them do it. They don't have eyelids. There's just one scale over the eyeball, so it fills up with the gunky fluid. Okay, so you can see it's looking pretty dull as well in coloration. In a few days' time, the eye will clear, and then a day later, it will slough its skin and it will look beautiful. Edges. This is something to think about if you're managing your garden or any bit of land trying to attract reptiles or increase habitat for them. Edges, they're disproportionately important to reptiles. Okay, there's a lot goes on in these interfaces, so there's lots of different ecological terms for them. Ecotones is a posh word. It's an edge basically, and it's where you get a real, pretty much similar to the shallow of a pond. Edges are so diverse. It's where you get a real rich diversity, floristic and invertebrate, everything. But it's great for reptiles because they can bask in the sun and just dash into cover instantly as soon as they're disturbed. Edges are so important for reptiles, particularly south-facing edges. Lots of examples. So edge of a sunny woodland, okay, not the woodland itself, but the edge of it. Grassland scrub edges. There's a pretty suburban example there. It's got 3 species of reptile at it. Interfaces with grassland of varying sward heights. So you can see you've got a short sward to the right and longer to the left behind the fence. Behind the fence, you can see patches of gorse. In itself, those patches of gorse are forming edges between the gorse and the grass. So there's loads of opportunities for reptiles and things that need to thermoregulate, ectothermic animals, loads of opportunities there. Not so much on this side of the fence, but the fence line itself is a good opportunity. And varying your sward heights, like we've discussed earlier, that's a great thing you can do in a garden for reptiles and amphibians and invertebrates. Looking at some fence lines, okay, you can see the right-hand side of the fence on the left, that's exposed to the sun. Now, those rails, lizards love sitting on them, and they've just got to dash into the cover immediately to escape. Similar thing going to the right there. It's a bit of a dry stone wall and a fence in front of it. Great places for reptiles. This fence line offers nothing for reptiles. It's got no structure there at all. On a windy day, everything, the wind chill factor will be considerable, not suitable at all. It needs structural diversity. That's a bit more like it. Kind of place you'd find grass snakes hanging out. Lots of tussocky stuff at the base of the actual fence posts. Here's an example. This is another fence line, another edge, and adders hibernate here. So at this time of year in the picture, there's no leaves on the trees, so it's not going to shade. So the adders have been hibernating in the root systems of those trees, and then they pull themselves out forward to bask when they emerge along that fence line, on that tussocky structure, right on the fence line, right next to where everybody's going past, okay, right on the edge. So there's the fence line. You can see the sheep fencing. There's an adder right on the edge of the path. But they don't move and people just go straight past them. People generally not looking at the ground on the edges, they're generally looking forward And reptiles are pretty accustomed to people moving backwards and forwards along tracks. It's when you stop and stare, that's when they get nervous. This is the diagonal support of a fence post. Lizards love them. You can see there's 3 lizards using it there. It's gotten dark with age, so it's going to soak up loads of heat. Lizards absolutely love basking on those diagonals. But it's not just the diagonals. There's a big gravid female. She's full of youngsters, and she's on an upright. You can see it's a well aged fence post. It's covered in lichen, but she's on it vertical, spreading herself out, soaking up as much sun as she can. She's gravid. She's full of young, but she's still spread herself out as like a solar panel to soak up as much heat as quickly as possible. She'll also be soaking heat up from below because the fence post has already been heated. So it's a double whammy. They don't want to spend any longer basking exposed to predators than they have to. There's a female lizard on the left and a male on the right doing the same thing on a fence post. Here's one who's managed to get on top of the fence post, and here's a closer look. That's a male. So fences are great if there's lots of vegetation around them. Some classic adder habitat on the Gower coast. So you can see there we've got the aspect, we've got a slope. So you've got what we call thermal momentum. It heats up quickly because of the slope. You've got gorse there, not a complete stand of gorse, it's patchy. So gorse, the root structures, they cause cracks and fissures and caves below ground, and they're perfect for adders to hibernate in, and other reptile species too. You can see the scree there, that will get hot, very warm, and radiate warmth out as well. This is in Bridgend, same thing going, different habitat. You've got the aspect, you've got gorse patches, bracken, adders there. Hard to spot there though. There's an adder doing what we call mosaic basking. So not basking right out in the open, but mosaic or cryptic basking. They can spend hours basking like that and not be detected. The snake knows I'm watching. I took that photograph. It knows I'm there. And if you can just make out at the top there, I've put that little yellow circle. You can see the adder's eye. It's looking right at me. You can see that. Closer to home, man-made edges, reptiles make use of them, less so often adders, but things like slowworms, common lizards, and occasionally grass snakes when they're moving from place to place. Grass snakes are very mobile species, will utilize these banks for basking. Railway lines, look at those banks, look at the aspect, look at the angle. It's going to soak up loads of sun. It's not shaded, is it? It's got patchy, complex vegetation structure. It's not disturbed by lots of people. It's perfect for reptiles. Same thing going here. And if you live in a terraced garden that backs onto a railway, then you've got a real good opportunity to make your garden a pit stop, a bit of a paradise for reptiles, because they're going to get there along the railway embankment. More examples of it. That tussocky grass structure you can see on the bank there. Compare that to the field next to it. It's just flat, no opportunities for something that's ectothermic at all. But along that bank, literally just that strip, you can get reptiles colonizing all kinds of habitats and using it to move from one to the other. Same thing by the road, same thing going there. Cars flying by all the time, lots of reptiles there. You're getting the idea, variations on a theme. Here we are, we've just got a strip of tussocky grass on either side of it, a narrow strip, but it's tussocky enough to support reptiles such as lizards. Connectivity, all those things that I just showed you, they are a form of connectivity, the railway tracks, etc. Reptiles aren't very good at dispersing without that. They can't travel across unsuitable habitat, the exception being the grass snake that will travel across virtually anything. So they're dependent on large areas of continuous habitat, which is much rarer these days, more often small patches linked up together by corridors. So the railway line and the gardens thing, that works with that. Really essential connectivity corridors for genetic diversity and what we said before about we've been able to recolonize after local extinctions. Here we've got a boundary hedge. So this is on farmland, completely inhospitable, grazed to death either side, but because it's a boundary hedge, there's a fence either side, and that strip along the middle is structurally diverse enough with a bit of gorse and tussocky grass to provide habitat for reptiles, and it's also got the gradient to have thermal momentum, and it's south-facing. So reptiles can travel connectivity-wise all along that route, that corridor, through an otherwise completely inhospitable desert for them. Habitat features, so log piles again, protruding objects, protruding out of vegetation. Lizards love basking on protruding objects like that, and then they can just drop off or run into the vegetation when they need to. Other habitat features are variations in the topography, like we said before. So look at those opportunities there. This is in Maesteg, lovely heather bank, but lots of different temperature gradients available there. Some common management tasks, basically keeping vegetation in check, and you've got to be careful how and when you do it. I told you about passive displacement, the 2 cuts, that kind of thing. That saves a lot of hassle. Something that you might be able to do in your garden or elsewhere, and something that's really missing out of grass snake ecology in most places, is egg-laying sites. So grass snakes have to travel to find egg-laying sites, and they regularly get run over. I'm always finding female grass snakes. It's heartbreaking with eggs that they haven't even managed to lay because they've been run over whilst they're doing their sweepstake gamble of a migration to go and find a compost heap, a dung pile, something like that, in which to deposit their eggs. We like to try and create one-stop shops where we've got plenty of choices for egg laying without them having to keep crossing roads. If you've got the time and energy to do it, it's one of the most productive things you can do for grass snakes. Makes a real big difference. Here's some unintentionally naturally occurring ones. Well, it's not natural, but man's waste not being used anymore. So failed hay bales like that, they generate so much heat and humidity. Grass snakes use them for egg laying. Same as the dung pile, same thing going there. Here's some female grass snakes on an egg laying site. Top right, there's some wood chip that will really churn out the heat. It doesn't last so long. It's good to mix it up with other materials. A rotting tree stump on the bottom left, that's like a semi-natural version. They'll lay their eggs in there. Grass cutting piles, as you can see on the bottom right, all options for grass snake egg laying sites. There's some friends of mine helping me make some. Now, this is at a site in the Vale of Glamorgan, and this photograph was taken about 12 years ago when we made quite a few egg laying sites for grass snakes. And I visited this site with Emily and Lauren not so long ago, sort of 10 or 12 years after we did this, and they've carried on doing it. And the really good news to hear from them was grass snake numbers have increased significantly in that period. So it was really good to hear that. Another example in the corner of a field, don't put them right out in the middle, put them against a linear feature so that the snakes can find it and get to it without being exposed to predators. And look at the results. There's a group of big, chunky female grass snakes all on a failed hay bale. Now, you'll notice the stinging nettles. When you're creating an egg-laying site, you're going to get stinging nettles around it because you're increasing the nutrients. So select carefully where you don't mind that happening. But it's not a bad thing to have a ring of protective stinging nettles protecting your snakes from people who might want to interfere. And if you look closely, you might be able to see the holes in that rotted hay bale that the female grass snakes use to get to the center of the heap. Now, they're very strong, and they literally force their head into something like that, then bend slightly, like you can see that female's at the bottom. You can see her neck is bent, and just force themselves, and really good at drilling holes through things like that. If you make egg laying sites for grass snakes, you'll benefit other species. So slow worms, there's a big chunky female slow worm. She's full of youngsters as well. You've got to be careful with rats. Don't put cooked food in it, whatever. It's not quite a compost heap. It's more organic matter you want to rot down naturally, okay? Reptile hibernation sites. Now, reptile hibernation sites are absolutely crucial for reptiles. They have to be frost-free, humid, safe from flooding, safe from predators, almost always have a south-facing aspect, and are normally in full or partial sun. Now, this is a adder hibernation site up in Torvine on the heath there, and you can see it's a variation in topography. It's a bit of a hollow and a long bank there. It's bathed in sunlight, lots of mature heather. The root structures will be creating lots of opportunities to get below ground and hence below the frost line when it's winter. And there's an adder there. They're not easy to spot. They're not crying out to be seen. There's a close-up for him. Okay, they're pretty cryptic. Here's a site in Pembrokeshire. That's an adder hibernation site right next to the road, and that's an adder right next to the road, literally inches. If you can look at the top picture, you can see it's like concave, the hedge, if that makes any sense. And there's that little concave area of the bottom picture with an adder in it, right next to the road. That's in Pembrokeshire. People walk straight past them. So burrows dug by other species enable reptiles to get below the frost line as well. Rotted tree stumps, root holes where trees have been ripped up in the wind. Large grass tussocks suit smaller reptiles, as do anthills that will hibernate within them. Old walls, basically abandoned human structures are very popular. Building foundations, piles of rubble, etc. Crumbling old dry stone walls, under logs, fallen trees, those kind of opportunities to escape the frost. Reptiles can hibernate singly or communally. Now, this is in a sand dune situation, same thing going there. I can see an adder, but I'll zoom in close view. There's the adder, that's the male adder. But he's also got that sand patch to warm up on. So he's really got a good charge spot there to heat up quickly. Okay. Communal hibernation, they're critical features for reptiles. So sometimes, well, when reptiles hibernate communally, it's not because they want to be with their mates, it's because the conditions are pretty hard to come by. So they tend to use the same feature. Okay. But communal hibernation sites occur everywhere. This is another Pembrokeshire hedgerow, and there's a young adder, common lizard, grass snake, slowworm, all using the same hibernation site. Nobody wants to eat each other when they're hibernating, or if they've just emerged, they're not interested. Okay, they need to just heat up. So you'll see all species together. So a communal hibernation site is vulnerable to damage. So even the good guys do it. I should remain nameless, but unintentionally. This was a wildlife conservation NGO did this damage unintentionally. It was well intentioned, but they didn't. It was for butterflies, I think, but they didn't realize that they completely destroyed a hibernation site full of adders at the time. Even removal of vegetation cover from a hibernation site can cause animals, when they emerge, to be vulnerable to predation. Okay, they need to be able to hide away. You can create hibernation sites. You can make them yourself. Do you really need one? Most robust populations already have sufficient hibernation habitat. So is it a priority? When it is often useful to do it is in cases with ecological consultants and mitigation when they're moving things around. Not my favorite subject, but you can do this. You can improve habitat for reptiles if you so want to. The key thing is to provide structural diversity below ground that they can get below the frost ground but won't get flooded. So making a heap and covering it with soil, basically what you want to do. Located in a sunny position, well-drained site, not prone to flooding. Make sure one of the banks faces south. So if you orientate it from east to west, then it will be south facing. Make it as big as possible. I see a lot of these tiny little well-intentioned ones being made are really not worth doing. It's just a tiny, tiny little pocket in the middle that would be frost-free. Much better having a long bank with lots of choices for them. Yeah, public disturbance is minimal. That's important. So right at the bottom there, please don't add or use pipes. I see lots of instructions, well-intended instructions on creating reptile hibernation sites, which advise you to put pipes in for them to gain entrance to. Please don't do that. Reptiles have been squeezing into tiny gaps for millennia, long before we invented pipes. If you put pipes as entrances, it will flood the entrance and drown them. So please don't use pipes. You'll see them in some of the old Wildlife Trust instruction things about making hibernation sites. And I think it was an idea someone came up with and it was just handed on. Please don't do it. It's dangerous as hell. Here's a timber one we created. This is in Bridgend. A great lot. We basically chopped down a load of pines, created a south-facing ride, and everything we chopped down and all the roots we pulled up, we pushed to one side, the south-facing side. Structurally diverse, ramble tangle, couple of 100 meters long. Reptiles loved it and hibernated in it pretty much within 2 years. Within 8 months of creating it, we found lizards there. There they are, all over it. Okay, but we ended up having all 4 reptile species there. Basically, we're trying to keep habitats open for light and heat, provide cover, not too much, refuge from weather and predators, diverse vegetation structure. Okay, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's marram, it doesn't matter if it's heather, it doesn't matter if it's gorse, Molinia, tussocky grass. It doesn't matter what it is, it's the structure. And edges and interfaces are disproportionately important. That enables reptiles, ectothermic creatures, to thermoregulate. Good connectivity is really important. We've discussed that. I've got to drive that home. Specialist stuff for egg-laying species, not so relevant with us now. And it's all about the location and the timing. Sometimes it's just a case of changing the time of year with land managers at which they do something. There's sensitive times of the year. You don't want to be disturbing the ground when there's things hibernating in it, for example. There's some links, I think Lauren put up for you. So there's the Amphibian and Habitat Management Handbook. It's pretty detailed. Reptile Habitat Management also, really useful thing, very detailed. Free downloads, don't have to pay a penny for these. I believe Lauren's got the links. Our colleagues, my friends and colleagues at the Freshwater Habitat Trust, they have a free download also, Pond Creation Toolkit. That's incredibly detailed, involved. It's fascinating reading. It's not all about garden ponds, but it's fascinating stuff. I thoroughly recommend it. Other ways you can get involved, they tend to be to do with recording. So ad hoc sightings, you've got the record pool. That's a really useful place for you to send your records into, not too involved either. During lockdown, when people couldn't get out the gardens, we set up the Garden Dragon Watch, and it's still going strong. So just what people spot in their gardens. And if you want to get more involved, it's a bit more complicated. The National Amphibian Survey and National Reptile Survey. We can incorporate stuff if you're already doing it. There's contacts for you. Okay, leave that up for a little bit. I do believe Lauren is probably recording this, so you can see all this afterwards. Those are the links. So thank you for listening, and fire away with your questions.
Thanks, Pete. That was brilliant. That was really great. So I have shared some of those links, as you mentioned, in the chat. But what we'll also be doing is sending a follow-up email to everyone that's come today. So we'll make sure that we include all the links that we've mentioned and ways to get involved.
Excellent.
Okay. Emily, are you happy for me to jump straight to the Q&As?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Brilliant. So we've had a couple of questions in, so thank you to everyone that's popped them in the Q&A for us. So I'll just work my way through. So I've got a question from Hilary. So Hilary said, are there any links to the frogs puddle / temporary pond idea? So she's sort of got a rough idea of obviously what you're talking about, but if you could sort of share things like dimensions or locations, or if there's a bit more information that we could share about that, that'd be great.
There aren't any links to it because I just made it up. It's my creation. Okay. Size doesn't matter. It can be Mickey Mouse shaped. It can be any shape you want to make it. What's important is it's not too deep. It's got to be a shallow puddle. Okay. Birds will use it as a bird bath as well. It doesn't matter if it dries out. You want it to in the summer, really. You don't want it to dry out when there's still tadpoles forming in it. And like I said before, it really doesn't matter if you use tap water. It really doesn't matter. It's even better if you use rainwater, if you've got a rain butt, etc. Or if you can dechlorinate your tap water beforehand by putting it in a big container and then using it. But it doesn't matter if you can't. It's much better than them drying out. I don't like to use it in ponds proper, as I said, because tap water is full of nutrients and you tend to get loads of duckweed. But when you're just making a puddle, which is used for a temporary period of the year, it doesn't matter, does it? So you can scrape it right out and make it completely inhospitable each year, because that's what you want it to do. You don't want it to build up predators like a pond does. So you're managing it in completely the opposite way that you would manage a pond. You will still get newts slipping into it, okay, but you'll get a lot more frogs as a result of doing that. It really doesn't matter what size, what shape at all, just as long as it's not deeper than 30 centimeters and a lot shallower than that in a lot of places too.
Well, thanks, Pete. So I've got a question as well. Did you add any plants to your garden pond that you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, or did you sort of let it colonise naturally? And what would be your sort of recommendation for that?
I did add plants to my garden ponds. They were very carefully taken from a native nursery. When we're doing stuff in the wider countryside, we don't do that. We just dig a hole and then we walk away, and then everything happens naturally. But generally in the garden situation, give it a helping hand. Just please don't plant any non-natives. Just take your time. The different aquatic nurseries, there's loads online. Make sure you stick to native and you can't go wrong, really. Just don't choose plants for big ponds. Don't put water lilies in, that kind of stuff. You just need small plants for garden ponds and puddles. Water forget-me-not, hornwort, that kind of stuff.
Brill. Oh, thanks, Pete. And then we've got two more in. So we've got one from Michael Cummins, and he's asked what the significance of the albino spawn that you mentioned earlier on in the presentation is, if there is any significance to that.
Just generally tends to show, it's the same with when you get strange colour form, unusual, atypical colour formations, it's generally the sign that you've got a large population. So when you see black rabbits hopping around, it's generally rabbits everywhere to throw up those odd, funny coloured ones. When we've got situations where we've got a lot of lizards, I find melanistic lizards, I find straw coloured lizards with no patterns on them. It's just a demonstration that you've got a really large population in order for it to throw out abnormalities like that. Haven't got a lot going for them if you're a brightly coloured pale frog in the British countryside, but some of them do survive because we see them breeding on occasion. But obviously it's a lot better to be a bit more subtly coloured. There's arguments about some reptiles being melanistic, as in black, because they can soak up more heat that way. I think that's just an obvious guess at it. I don't think that's why they're black. It probably is an advantage of doing it, but I don't think that's why they're black. Get a lot of melanistic lizards, a lot of melanistic adders, occasionally slow worms, even more occasionally grass snakes. Albino frogs see quite often, if I'm honest, but I spend a lot of time out at night looking for stuff, so that's when you're more likely to see them. So no real significance, just an indication that it's probably a very large population to be able to throw up those oddities like that.
Brill. Oh, thanks, Pete. So we've just got two more left to go. So we've got a question in from Iona. And Iona said that the local park has a sort of temporary water body where frogs lay eggs each year. And is there something that they could do to make it a bit more hidden so it's not disturbed by people? So they've given a bit more detail. There's some longer species of grass around it, some trees, some duckweed floating around. They don't think food's an issue, but there is a problem with sort of trash and disturbance, I think, from people using the area.
Yeah, that's a very common issue. Don't really want trees around a pond. Trees shade a pond and make it not much good for frog tadpoles. Frogs are looking for shallow water that will warm up really quickly, so the tadpoles can be out of there really quick. The warmer it is, the quicker they grow. So you don't want trees around it. They shade it, but they also drop leaves in it, and you get eutrophication. It makes the water really, really nutrient rich and not good at all. Vegetation around the edges, longer grass, which is less comfortable for humans, might be your only option. To be honest, it's a tricky one. Yeah, there's just too many people. that's the problem. But yeah, well observed. Temporary pond. It's in a ditch or a puddle area, is it? Something like that?
It just says so just within a local park, so it hasn't sort of said specifically where. But yeah, and I guess sort of following on from that, in a sense, we've got another question in terms of sort of disturbance. So we've got a question about sort of just general thoughts about ponds in public spaces and dogs and the relationship between the two.
Well, you've heard me banging on about this enough times, Lauren. I've got a dog, everybody. I have a dog. She's very elderly. She doesn't go for walks anymore. She's 14. She's senile. I don't take her for walks, but I'm not going to replace her. Dogs. There's a lot more dogs than there used to be. There's a lot more people than there used to be. There's two issues. There's a lot of issues with terrestrial habitat. There's been studies on nature reserves focusing on a 2-meter radius of the paths, where dogs are on leads, and the toxicity of the ground there. If it was a farm, it would be shut down overnight. Really toxic levels. When it comes to ponds, when a dog jumps in a pond, lots of things happen. It disturbs the silt at the bottom. It clouds up the water. And if another dog's in there 10 minutes later, it never settles. So the water's permanently, the word we use is turbid. It's permanently turbid. So it isn't getting the light levels yet again because the water isn't letting the light levels through. The dogs will also destroy vegetation, particularly vegetation structures, macrophytes, aquatic vegetation that newts have very carefully been laying their eggs in. They absolutely trash it within minutes. But perhaps even more concerning, spot-on flea treatments. Frontline, is it they call it? Lots of studies done on that recently, and the results were shocking because of the regular immersion of dogs that have been treated by spot-on flea treatments. It's an insecticide, so invertebrate levels in ponds and rivers, etc., are concerningly low as a result of that. And when you think about it, if you're reducing the amount of invertebrates in the river or an aquatic system, that's the baseline ecology. You know, you're not going to get anything else then either, are you? Because everything depends on invertebrates. So dogs and ponds, it's complicated stuff. We're always digging ponds all over the place, and quite often we'll be doing several at one site. And what we try and do is create a sacrificial dog pond right next to a track, and then other ponds that dogs don't get anywhere near. We're probably going to take it a stage further and have interpretation explaining this in the future, purely because it's becoming more of an issue, because there are more people, there are more dogs. And then you get professional dog walkers. The person has a dog, but they don't take them for a walk. They pay someone else to do it. When you get van loads of dogs pulling up one after the other, that really does wreck terrestrial habitat, disturb ground nesting birds, all of it. And ponds the same. So yeah, ponds and dogs don't really go well together. Dogs love jumping in the pond. Yeah, sacrificial ponds specifically for dogs, that's the way forward, I think, because really is having quite a profound effect on many ponds across the country.
Oh, thanks, Pete. That's brilliant. So I think that, yeah, we've run through all of our Q&A section. So I just wanted to thank you again on behalf of the Vale LNP. It's a brilliant presentation, lots of information to take in, and we've had some lovely comments in the chat as well. So a couple of people are actually going to be doing some follow-up surveying, and yeah, lots of people have said thank you for a very informative presentation. So as Emily said, we've popped in the chat. We will be sending a follow-up email. There's an email address if you would like to get in touch with us, and we'll also be sending a feedback survey. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts really on that. I'm just keeping an eye in case anything else comes through. A second. So yes, everyone's just saying thank you. Great. So yeah, I guess we will wrap it up there. Thanks to everyone and have a great evening, and keep us updated if you're doing any work in the Vale or elsewhere. We'd love to hear about it. So yeah, do keep in touch and keep us updated. And there's lots of information on the ARC website that we will point you to when we send you those follow-up resources. So thanks everybody, and yeah, we hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.